but the effect of her being on those around her was incalculably diffusive. For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who live faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. That's from Middlemarch by George Eliot. George Eliot was, of course, the pen name of Marianne Evans, one of the best-known and most important of the English Victorian novelists, who found it necessary at the beginning of her writing career to take the pen name of a man in order to get her works published. So good evening, friends, and welcome once again to Storytime for Adults. Stories post the fourth Monday of every month, and in certain months or seasons, we may see some extra stories produced. It's now the month of June, which means we are halfway through the year already and beginning to feel the summer weather here in Oklahoma. And of course, June is also Pride Month. This got me to thinking about who and what we should read, and in thinking about the issue, it brought to mind the quote I just opened with from Middlemarch: "Those who live faithfully a hidden life." Marianne Evans, of course, was not herself part of the LGBTQ community so far as we know, but in her need to take a male pen name in order to publish her writing, she was herself living a sort of hidden life until her own authorship was made public. For her and for her characters in Middlemarch, the issue is misogyny and gender roles, but the general sentiment is one that I find seems to resonate deeply. This is not meant to be a prolonged rumination on the idea of the closet. I really have no place to do that, but the issue is relevant to this evening's author. So who and what are we reading tonight? An Irish poet, author, playwright, and leading member of the aesthetic movement, Oscar Wilde found great popularity and success in his lifetime, and his later trial and criminal conviction for gross indecency for consensual homosexual acts is one of our earliest and best-known examples of the modern spectacle of the celebrity trial. Oscar Finnegal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde was born on October 16, 1854, to Jane Nelge Lady Wilde and Sir William Wilde in Westland Road, Dublin. Wilde was the second of three children, with an older brother, William, and younger sister, Isola. He also had three half-siblings from his father, who were all born out of wedlock and before his parents had met. Wilde's mother was herself a poet and devoted lifelong Irish nationalist. His father, Sir William, was Ireland's leading ophthalmologic surgeon, that is, an ear and eye surgeon, who also wrote extensively about Irish archaeology, folklore, and mythology. Wilde was baptized into the Anglican Church as a baby, but was later baptized a second time in secret into the Catholic Church at the behest of his mother. This will be somewhat relevant later, I promise. The young Oscar lived a very privileged life growing up, being educated at home by private tutors and with a French nursemaid and German governess, who both taught Wilde their native languages. From an early age, then, Wilde had become a polyglot, and he would notably add more languages to his repertoire throughout his life. At the age of 10, he was sent to be a boarder at the Portora Royal School, where he excelled in the study of classics. The young Wilde, in fact, developed a reputation for being particularly skilled in giving ad hoc oral translations of Greek and Latin texts. Those would be the fourth and fifth languages that Wilde learned, incidentally. This skill eventually earned him a scholarship and admittance to Trinity College, Dublin. At Trinity, Wilde's tutor was a famous classicist named J.P. Mahaffy. Oscar and he seemed to get along quite well, and once Wilde became famous, Mahaffy was known to boast that he had created Oscar Wilde. Later in life, however, after Wilde's trial and imprisonment, that same professor who had so close a relationship with him called Oscar Wilde the one blot on an otherwise illustrious career. It should be noted here that Oscar Wilde had helped this self-same professor in the writing and compiling of one of his most famous and well-regarded books, Social Life in Greece. At Trinity, Wilde joined the University Philosophical Society and began to take up with the early aesthetic movement. He also began distinguishing himself academically, eventually winning a coveted scholarship to Magdalena College, Oxford, where he would become a dedicated member of the aesthetic and decadent movements, becoming the peacock-feathered, flamboyant Oscar Wilde that people are more familiar with, the very picture of the late Victorian dandy. After failing to secure a position at the Oxford Union, however, after graduation, Wilde eventually returned to Dublin and got back in touch with one Florence Balcom, a childhood sweetheart of his. Florence, however, shortly became engaged to and then married another man, who just so happened to be named Bram Stoker. In 1878, at the age of 24, Wilde departed permanently for England, seeking a classics position. He was not successful in this, but he did begin publishing his poetry, and eventually in 1882, at the suggestion of a friend, he went on a lecture tour of North America about aestheticism. The tour was only supposed to last 4 months, but was so successful that it continued for almost a year. Aestheticism was becoming a popular movement at the time, and of course was also widely caricatured and criticized as well. It was even lambasted by Gilbert and Sullivan in the comic opera Patience. So Wilde returned to London, with occasional sojourns to Paris, and began publishing plays. In 1884, he married a woman named Constance Lloyd, a young woman from a wealthy family whom he'd met 3 years previously before his American tour. The couple would have 2 sons together, Cyril and Vivian, in 1885 and 1886. Sometime around 1886, Wilde's marriage to Constance became more strained. During this time, he would also meet the 17-year-old Robert Ross, who, quite unusually for the time, was openly gay. Ross appears to have seduced Wilde and become his first same-sex lover sometime around this time. For the remainder of the 1880s, Wilde turned his attention to journalism and editing, and in 1887 became the editor-in-chief of the Ladies' World magazine, which Wilde rebranded as the Woman's World magazine. Under his stewardship, Wilde significantly elevated the tone and content of the magazine, running serious articles on culture, parenting, politics, and world affairs, while continuing to include discussions of the latest fashion and the arts. I mean, how could Wilde have possibly cut that? He was an aesthetic. He also used his significant literary and artistic contacts, as well as that of his mother, Lady Wilde, and his wife Constance, to procure a steady stream of high-quality content, including stories intended to be read to children by their parents. During this time, Wilde continued to write and publish essays, short fiction, poetry, and plays, though his production would markedly increase after leaving journalism. In 1890, Wilde published the first version of one of his most famous works, The Picture of Dorian Gray, in which a beautiful young man makes a Faustian deal to always stay young and beautiful while the ravages of time and his own physical and moral degeneracy play out in the painting of him. This was a disturbing and frankly rather astute observation about the relationship between art and decadence at the time, especially as related to personal morality, and quite shocked Victorian sensibilities. You would expect nothing less from Wilde. There's much more that he wrote and published, of course. Salome, The Importance of Being Earnest, probably his most famous work, but we're running a bit long here. In 1891, Wilde was introduced to Lord Alfred Douglas, the son of the Marquis of Queensberry. The two began a rather torrid and not always completely discreet love affair. Douglas also introduced Wilde to the Victorian underground of male prostitution. The Marquis of Queensberry was notorious for his atheism, for being disagreeable, for regularly quarreling with his son, and for his outspoken homophobia. He also formulated the Queensberry rules that are the basis for modern boxing. He was none too pleased with his son being seen publicly with the very flamboyant Wilde. In February of 1895, things came to a head. The Marquis left a calling card for Wilde at a private club, the Albemarle, to which he was a member, inscribed, "For Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." Against the advice of his friends, Wilde decided to pursue a private lawsuit against the Marquis for libel, since the note amounted to a public accusation that Wilde had committed sodomy, which was a crime. The libel trial of the Marquis of Queensberry became a massive cause célèbre and issue of major gossip. During the course of the trial, and to defend his claims against Wilde, the Marquis ended up revealing many of the details of Wilde's private life. Wilde had, by this time, been living a hidden double life, and the details of the second life, including the seediest parts of London's underbelly and Wilde's many affairs, only confirmed the Marquis's claims. The Marquis being acquitted meant that under English law, Wilde was now financially responsible for the entirety of the Marquis's extensive legal defense fees. This itself was enough to bankrupt Wilde, but the worst part was yet to come. Almost immediately after leaving the courthouse from the libel trial, a criminal arrest warrant was issued for Wilde. Some friends urged him to take ship to France, while other friends and his mother advised him to stay and fight. After an initial mistrial, on May 25th, 1895, Oscar Wilde and Alfred Taylor were found guilty of gross indecency and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. Wilde was released from prison in May of 1897 and immediately took ship to Dieppe, France, never to return to England. During his imprisonment, his wife Constance had changed her name and their son's last names to Holland and moved to Switzerland to dissociate herself from Wilde. They never divorced, but Constance did force Wilde to give up his parental rights and refused to send him any money in support so long as he had any association with Douglas or Taylor. Wilde never saw his sons again, and Constance would die in 1898 in Switzerland after a botched surgery. Wilde would spend the last 3 years of his life in poverty and exile, going by the name Sebastian Melmoth and seeking conversion to Catholicism, a faith whose rituals and theology had deeply interested and moved Wilde from a young age, and whom he had some familiarity with from his early childhood through his mother. Wilde did briefly reunite with Douglas for a few months in late 1897 in northern France. Under threats from both families of cutting off financial support, however, the men separated again. Wilde would eventually die, aged 46, in November of 1890 in Paris of a cerebral hemorrhage, whose cause is not definitively known, though Wilde had been drinking very heavily since his release from prison. So tonight, we're going to be reading a short story by Oscar Wilde, titled The Happy Prince. It was first published in 1888, and was actually written as a children's story, believe it or not. It is, however, one of his very best. The main theme of this story also bears inverted similarity to his later work, The Picture of Dorian Gray. And of course, The Picture of Dorian Gray is, in a way, very much about that idea of a hidden life, and its oftentimes hidden effects. So, as is usual, I've prattled on for more than long enough, and we should get to reading. The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde. High above the city on a tall column stood the statue of the Happy Prince. He was gilded all over with thin leaves of fine gold. For eyes he had 2 bright sapphires, and a large red ruby glowed on his sword hilt. He was very much admired indeed. "He is as beautiful as a weathercock," remarked one of the town councillors who wished to gain a reputation for having artistic tastes. "Only not quite so useful," he added, fearing lest people should think him unpractical, which he really was not. "Why can't you be like the Happy Prince?" asked a sensible mother of her little boy who was crying for the moon. "The Happy Prince never dreams of crying for anything." "I'm glad there's someone in the world who's quite happy," muttered a disappointed man as he gazed at the wonderful statue. "He looks just like an angel," said the charity children as they came out of the cathedral in their bright scarlet cloaks and their clean white pinafores. "How do you know?" said the mathematical master. "You've never seen one." "Ah, but we have in our dreams," answered the children. And the mathematical master frowned and looked very severe, for he did not approve of children dreaming. One night there flew over the city a little swallow. His friends had gone away to Egypt 6 weeks before, but he had stayed behind, for he was in love with the most beautiful reed. He'd met her early in the spring as he was flying down the river after a big yellow moth, and had been so attracted by her slender waist that he had stopped to talk to her. "Shall I love you?" said the swallow, who liked to come to the point at once, and the reed made him a low bow. So he flew round and round, touching the water with his wings and making silver ripples. This was his courtship, and it lasted all through the summer. "It is a ridiculous attachment," twittered the other swallows. "She has no money, and far too many relations." And indeed, the river was quite full of reeds. Then, when the autumn came, they all flew away. After they had gone, he felt lonely, and began to tire of his lady love. She has no conversation, he said, and I'm afraid that she's a coquette, for she's always flirting with the wind. And certainly, whenever the wind blew, the reed made the most graceful curtsies. I admit that she is domestic, he continued, but I love traveling, and my wife, consequently, should love traveling also. Will you come away with me? He said finally to her, but the reed shook her head. She was so attached to her home. You've been trifling with me, he cried. I'm off to the pyramids, goodbye. And he flew away. All day long he flew, and at night time he arrived at the city. Where shall I put up? He said. I hope the town has made preparations. Then he saw the statue on the tall column. I will put up there, he cried. It is a fine position with plenty of fresh air. So he alighted just between the feet of the happy prince. I have a golden bedroom, he said softly to himself as he looked around, and he prepared to go to sleep. But just as he was putting his head under his wing, a large drop of water fell on him. What a curious thing, he cried. There's not a single cloud in the sky. The stars are quite clear and bright, and yet it's raining. The climate in the north of Europe is absolutely dreadful. The reed used to like the rain, but that was merely her selfishness. Then another drop fell. What is the use of a statue if it cannot keep the rain off? He said. I must look for a good chimney pot. And he determined to fly away. But before he'd open his wings, a third drop fell. And he looked up and saw, what did he see? The eyes of the happy prince were filled with tears, and tears were running down his golden cheeks. His face was so beautiful in the moonlight that the little swallow was filled with pity. Who are you? He said. I am the happy prince. Why are you weeping then? Asked the swallow. You've quite drenched me. When I was alive and had a human heart, answered the statue, I did not know what tears were, for I lived in the palace of Sanssouci, where sorrow is not allowed to enter. In the daytime, I played with my companions in the garden, and in the evening, I led the dance in the great hall. Round the garden ran a very lofty wall, but I never cared to ask what lay beyond it. Everything about me was so beautiful. My courtiers called me the happy prince, and happy indeed I was, if pleasure be happiness. So I lived, and so I died. And now that I'm dead, they have set me up here so high that I can see all the ugliness and all the misery of my city. And though my heart is made of lead, yet I cannot choose but weep. What, is he not solid gold? Said the swallow to himself. He was too polite to make any personal remarks out loud. Far away, continued the statue in a low musical voice, far away in a little street there is a poorhouse. One of the windows is open, and through it I can see a woman seated at a table. Her face is thin and worn, and she has coarse red hands, all pricked by the needle, for she's a seamstress. She's embroidering passion flowers on a satin gown for the loveliest of the Queen's maids of honor to wear at the next court ball. In a bed in the corner of the room, her little boy is lying ill. He has a fever and is asking for oranges. His mother has nothing to give him but river water, so he's crying. Swallow, swallow, little swallow, will you not bring her the ruby out of my sword hilt? My feet are fastened to this pedestal, and I cannot move. I am waited for in Egypt, said the swallow. My friends are flying up and down the Nile and talking to the large lotus flowers. Soon they will go to sleep in the tomb of the great king. The king is there himself in his painted coffin. He's wrapped in yellow linen and embalmed with spices. Round his neck is a chain of pale green jade, and his hands are like withered leaves. Swallow, swallow, little swallow, said the prince. Will you not stay with me for one night and be my messenger? The boy is so thirsty, and the mother so sad. I don't think I like boys, answered the swallow. Last summer, when I was staying in the river, there were two rude boys, the miller's sons, who were always throwing stones at me. They never hit me, of course. We swallows fly far too well for that. And besides, I come up from a family famous for its agility. But still, it was a mark of disrespect. But the happy prince looked so sad but the little swallow was sorry. "It is very cold here," he said, "but I will stay with you for one night and be your messenger." "Thank you, little swallow," said the prince. So the swallow picked out the great ruby from the prince's sword and flew away with it in his beak over the roofs of the town. He passed by the cathedral tower where the white marble angels were sculpted. He passed by the palace and heard the sound of dancing. A beautiful girl came out on the balcony with her lover. "How wonderful the stars are," he said to her, "and how wonderful is the power of love." "I hope my dress will be ready in time for the state ball," she answered. "I have ordered passion flowers to be embroidered on it, but the seamstresses are so lazy." He passed over the river and saw the lanterns hanging to the masts of the ships. At last, he came to the poorhouse and looked in. The boy was tossing feverishly on his bed, and the mother had fallen asleep. She was so tired. In he hopped and laid the great ruby on the table beside the woman's thimble. Then he flew gently round the bed, fanning the boy's forehead with his wings. "How cool I feel," said the boy. "I must be getting better." And he sank into a delicious slumber. Then the swallow flew back to the happy prince and told him what he had done. "It is curious," he remarked, "but I feel quite warm now, although it is so cold." "That is because you have done a good action," said the prince. And the little swallow began to think, and then he fell asleep. Thinking always made him sleepy. When day broke, he flew down to the river and had a bath. "What a remarkable phenomenon," said the professor of ornithology as he was passing over the bridge. "A swallow in winter!" And he wrote a long letter about it to the local newspaper. Everyone quoted it. It was full of so many words that they could not understand. "Tonight I go to Egypt," said the swallow, and he was in high spirits at the prospect. He visited all the public monuments and sat a long time on top of the church steeple. Wherever he went, the sparrows chirped and said to each other, "What a distinguished stranger!" So he enjoyed himself very much. And when the moon rose, he flew back to the happy prince. "Have you any commissions for Egypt?" he cried. "I'm just starting." "Swallow, swallow, little swallow," said the prince, "will you not stay with me one night longer?" "I am waited for in Egypt," answered the swallow. "Tomorrow my friends will fly up to the second cataract. The river horse coaches there among the bulrushes, and on a great granite throne sits the god Memnon. All night long he watches the stars, and when the morning star shines, he utters one cry of joy, and then he's silent. At noon, the yellow lions come down to the water's edge to drink. They have eyes like green barrels, and their roar is louder than the roar of the cataract." "Swallow, swallow, little swallow," said the prince. Far away across the city, I see a young man in a garret. He's leaning over a desk covered with papers, and in a tumbler by his side, there's a bunch of withered violets. His hair is brown and crisp, and his lips are red as a pomegranate, and he has large and dreamy eyes. He's trying to finish a play for the director of the theater, but he is too cold to write anymore. There is no fire in the grate, and hunger has made him faint. "I will wait with you one night longer," said the swallow, who really had a good heart. "Shall I take him another ruby?" "Alas, I have no rubies now," said the prince. "My eyes are all that I have left. They are made of rare sapphires, which were brought out of India 1,000 years ago. Pluck out one of them and take it to him. He will sell it to the jeweler and buy food and firewood and finish his play." "Dear prince," said the swallow, I cannot do that," and began to weep. "Swallow, swallow, little swallow," said the prince. "Do as I command you." So the swallow plucked out the prince's eye and flew away to the student's garret. It was easy enough to get in, as there was a hole in the roof. Through this he darted and came into the room. The young man had his head buried in his hands, so he did not hear the flutter of the bird's wings. And when he looked up, he found the beautiful sapphire lying on the withered violets. I'm beginning to be appreciated, he cried. This is from some great admirer. Now I can finish my play. And he looked quite happy. The next day, the swallow flew down to the harbor. He sat on the mast of a large vessel and watched the sailors hauling big chests out of the hold with ropes. Heave-ho! They shouted as each chest came up. I am going to Egypt, cried the swallow. But nobody minded, and when the moon rose, he flew back to the happy prince. I'm come to bid you goodbye, he cried. Swallow, swallow, little swallow, said the prince. Will you not stay with me one night longer? It's winter, answered the swallow, and the chill snow will be here soon. In Egypt the sun is warm on the green palm trees, and the crocodiles lie in the mud and look lazily about them. My companions are building a nest in the temple of Baalbec, and the pink and white doves are watching them and cooing to each other. Dear prince, I must leave you, but I will never forget you. And next spring, I will bring you back 2 beautiful jewels in place of those you've given away. The ruby shall be redder than a red rose, and the sapphire shall be as blue as the great sea. In the square below, said the happy prince, there stands a little match girl. She's let her matches fall in the gutter, and they're all spoiled. Her father will beat her if she does not bring home some money, and she's crying. She has no shoes or stockings, and her little head is bare. Pluck out my other eye and give it to her, and her father will not beat her. I will stay with you one night longer, said the swallow, but I cannot pluck out your eye. You would be quite blind then. Swallow, swallow, little swallow, said the prince. Do as I command you. So he plucked out the prince's other eye and darted down with it. He swooped past the match girl and slipped the jewel into the palm of her hand. What a lovely bit of glass, cried the little girl, and she ran home laughing. Then the swallow came back to the prince. You are blind now, he said, so I will stay with you always. No, little swallow, said the poor prince, you must go away to Egypt. I will stay with you always, said the swallow, and he slept at the prince's feet. And the next day he sat on the prince's shoulder and told him stories of what he'd seen in strange lands. He told him of the red ibises who stand in large rows on the banks of the Nile and catch goldfish in their beaks, of the Sphinx who is as old as the world itself and lives in the desert and knows everything, of the merchants who walk slowly by the side of their camels and carry amber beads in their hands, of the king of the mountains of the moon, and of the green snake that sleeps in a palm tree and has 20 priests to feed it with honey cakes, and of the pygmies who sail over a big lake on large flat leaves and are always at war with the butterflies. Dear little swallow, said the prince, you tell me of marvelous things, but more marvelous than anything is the suffering of men and of women. There's no mystery so great as misery. Fly over my city, little swallow, and tell me what you see there. So the swallow flew over the great city and saw the rich making merry in their beautiful houses, while the beggars were sitting at the gates. He flew into dark lanes and saw the white faces of starving children looking out listlessly at the black streets under the archway of a bridge. 2 little boys were lying in one another's arms to try and keep themselves warm. How hungry we are, they said. You must not lie here, shouted the watchman, and they wandered out into the rain. Then he flew back and told the prince what he'd seen. I am covered with fine gold, said the prince. You must take it off leaf by leaf and give it to my poor. The living always think that gold can make them happy. Leaf after leaf of the fine gold the swallow picked off, until the happy prince looked quite dull and gray. Leaf after leaf of the fine gold he brought to the poor, and the children's faces grew rosier, and they laughed and played games in the street. We have bread now, they cried. Then the snow came, and after the snow came the frost. The streets looked as if they were made of silver. They were so bright and glistening. Long icicles like crystal daggers hung down from the eaves of the houses. Everybody went about in furs, and the little boys wore scarlet caps and skated on the ice. The poor little swallow grew colder and colder, but he would not leave the prince. He loved him too well. He picked up crumbs outside the baker's door when the baker was not looking, and tried to keep himself warm by flapping his wings. But at last, he knew that he was going to die. He had just strength to fly up to the prince's shoulder once more. "Goodbye, dear prince," he murmured. "Will you let me kiss your hand?" "I am glad that you are going to Egypt at last, little swallow," said the prince. "You have stayed too long here. But you must kiss me on the lips, for I love you well." "It is not Egypt that I am going," said the swallow. "I'm going to the house of death. Death is the brother of sleep, is he not?" And he kissed the happy prince on the lips and fell down dead at his feet. At that moment, a curious crack sounded inside the statue, as if something had broken. The fact is that the leaden heart had snapped right in two. It certainly was a dreadfully hard frost. Early the next morning, the mayor was walking in the square below in company with the town councilors. As they passed the column, he looked up at the statue. "Dear me, how shabby the happy prince looks," he said. "How shabby indeed," cried the town councilors, who always agreed with the mayor, and they went up to look at it. "The ruby has fallen out of his sword. His eyes are gone, and his gold is... and he's no longer golden," said the mayor, in fact. "Yes," said the mayor, in fact. "He's a little better than a beggar." "A little better than a beggar," said the town councilors. "And here is actually a dead bird at his feet," continued the mayor. "We must really issue a proclamation that birds are not to be allowed to die here." And the town clerk made a note of the suggestion. So they pulled down the statue of the happy prince. "As he's no longer beautiful, he's no longer useful," said the art professor at the university. Then they melted the statue in a furnace, and the mayor held a meeting of the corporation to decide what was to be done with the metal. "We must have another statue, of course," he said, "and it shall be a statue of myself." "Or myself," said each of the town councilors, and they quarreled. When I last heard of them, they were quarreling still. "What a strange thing," said the overseer of the workmen at the foundry. "This broken lead heart will not melt in the furnace. We must throw it away." So he threw it on a dust heap, where the dead swallow was also lying. "Bring me the two most precious things in the city," said God to one of his angels. And the angel brought him the leaden heart and the dead bird. "You have rightly chosen," said God, "for in my garden of paradise this little bird shall sing forevermore, and in my city of gold the happy prince shall praise me." Not exactly a happy ending there. Sorry about that. But I think it is a quite good story. Perhaps a little bit more appropriate for adults now than kids. But nevertheless. So, I hope you have enjoyed our story time. If so, leave us a comment below. Let us know. If you didn't like it, or you have criticism or suggestions, leave that below as well. It's fine. And I hope you have a good evening, and I will see you all next month. Thank you.